So welcome to this session titled Dairy Milk versus Non-Dairy, a look at consumer trends, nutrition, and sustainability perceptions, sponsored by Quality Liquid Feeds. QLF was started in 1977 by Kenny Berg in Southwest Wisconsin. Over the last 40 years, the company has grown to 17 manufacturing facilities located across the United States. We at QLF are proud to be part of American agriculture and support America's farmers and ranchers in their feeding programs. I am Rachel Kennecke, and with me throughout the conference is Sabrina Yankee and John Benversi, and we are excited to be sponsoring this session this morning with our speaker, Jen Walsh. Jen Walsh, Vice President of Insights and Strategy at Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin, is a consumer insights professional with 20+ years of experience in market research. With a keen eye for concise and actionable insights, she is able to translate the voice of the consumer into strategic opportunities. Prior to joining Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin in 2015, Jen worked with clients in a variety of industries, including consumer packaged goods, retail, financial services, and healthcare. She believes that most of life's problems can be solved with a long nap, a good laugh, and an aged cheddar. Please help me in welcoming Jen Walsh.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here today. I have to tell you real quickly, I was at a football party this weekend, and like I usually do, I started talking about cheese. Not just out of the blue, someone had brought cheese curds, so I saw this as my opportunity to talk about cheese curds. What are cheese curds? Why do they squeak? Did you know about Wisconsin's master cheesemaker, newly certified in cheese curds? And I will tell you, once I start talking about cheese, it's a pretty slippery slope. And my friends know this. I was in the kitchen, a friend of mine came in, heard me talking about cheese, did a 180, walked out, and I heard him mutter under his breath, "Oh my God, she's talking about cheese again." So I'm really happy to be here today, where I know I'm surrounded by people who like to talk about cheese and dairy at least as much as I do, and maybe even more. So before I get started, I am going to warn you guys. You will hear me use the term almond milk. Hold your booze. Please don't throw your shoes at me. Let me explain why I say almond milk. I fully support everything we heard this morning. I fully support the legislation on standards of identity. I fully support the enforcement of those standards. But part of my role at Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin, the insights part of my title, is I'm in charge of bringing the voice of the consumer to the organization and to the industry. And I will tell you that consumers say the word almond milk. Right? We're really good at sitting around in conference rooms and convention centers like this one and talking to ourselves a lot, but we need to be incorporating the voice of the consumer. If we're going to have meaningful relationships with these consumers that we rely upon, at the very least, we need to be speaking the same language as they do. So that's why you'll hear me say almond milk. And one other thing, I'm not sure that the alternatives to almond milk are much better for us. So we'll often hear, we heard this morning, plant-based. I'm not sure that that's a win for us either. Using the term plant-based, I think affords these products a real health halo that they really don't deserve. Plant-based sounds really healthy, right? We all grew up being told to eat our fruits and our vegetables, eat your plants, fruits and vegetables. But when you look at the ingredients in these products, it's not leafy greens. It's things like tapioca starch, it's guar gum, which, yeah, I guess those are plants. So is sugar, right? By this stretch, we could call a candy bar plant-based, right? It's made from cocoa and sugar, those are plants. But that would make it seem a lot healthier than it really is. We could call a cigarette plant-based. I don't know why they don't. I think that's a great marketing idea. If you know anybody who works at Philip Morris, they should get on that. But I just think plant-based isn't necessarily going to help us either, because it sounds a lot healthier than it is. That's why I'm talking in the voice of the consumer, of the customer, because we need to be connecting with them and using the terms they use. So with that, let me get started. Let me just start by setting the stage. We're here, of course, we're talking about dairy. Let's make sure that we all have the same facts and the same figures so that we know where we're starting off together. So we know, of course, that milk is in nearly every household in America. 93% of households have white milk in the fridge. That's nearly 120 million households buy white milk. This is a huge number. There are very few categories that have household penetration rates this high. Toilet paper, yes. Toothpaste, hopefully. But to have a household penetration of 93% is really incredible. It's very high. But of course, we know that even though almost every household has milk in the fridge, at the same time, we know that milk consumption has been declining. This isn't news to anybody. This chart goes back 40 years to 1978. And even though my chart only goes back 40 years, I will tell you the trend goes back even further than that. It starts in the 40s. So there are lots of reasons for the decline in milk consumption. We've seen incredible innovation in the beverage aisle, lots of competition where there used to not be as much. It used to be if you wanted a beverage, you got coffee, you got orange juice, or you got milk. Now you go into the grocery store, the beverage aisle is an entire aisle full of beverages on both sides. Even the cereal aisle only has cereal on one side. Now you can get, of course, sodas of any kind, decaf, diets. You can get the kombuchas, you can get shelf-stable coffee. So there's a ton of innovation in the beverage aisle. And those companies that are making these beverages have huge advertising budgets. Coca-Cola's global ad budget is nearly $4 billion. So they have a lot of money to promote these new products in the dairy aisle. We also see consumers are eating less cereal. And when they eat less cereal, of course, it means they're buying less milk, because what do you have? A bowl of cereal, you put milk on it. Less cereal, less milk. And we're changing a lot in how we eat and what we eat that has had an impact here too. We've become much more global in our palates, right? It's easier to see having a glass of milk for dinner when you're having a casserole and some green beans. If you're having sushi, it's harder to see that going very well. Sushi is fairly new to America, right? 20 years ago, probably wouldn't have had sushi for dinner. When I was waiting earlier, I Googled sushi restaurant near me. I had 20 sushi restaurants pop up near me. So as we become more global, as our tastes change, as what we eat changes, what we drink changes too. So there's lots of reasons for the fluid milk consumption numbers going down. But one other thing I want to point out is that at the same time that fluid milk consumption is down, overall dairy consumption is up. So fluid milk was down 39% in the past 40 years, but overall dairy consumption, this includes milk, it includes cheese and yogurt and ice cream, all those good dairy products that we love, actually up 19% in the past 40 years. So sometimes we can get a little doom and gloomy, right, thinking about fluid milk consumption, but we have to not miss the forest for the trees here, that overall dairy consumption is up. And again, it's because we are now, where we used to have 44% of our total dairy consumption was fluid milk, 40 years ago, today it's less than half that. It's about half that, 23%. We used to drink our milk, now we eat our milk. So I say that just to put everything in context. I am going to be spending most of the session talking about fluid milk, but I just want to put everything in context because overall dairy consumption is up. But I mentioned that fluid milk consumption is down. Just as consumption is down, of course, retail sales are down. That makes sense. My chart here only goes to 2018. We do have 2019 data in-house now, but we're still looking at the numbers. But I will tell you, a sneak preview, the numbers for 2019 will continue this trend. We will see, again, retail sales of fluid milk being down. Don't expect a big turnaround. But there are some bright spots in the world of fluid milk. We see the lactose-free milk is seeing great growth at retail. I think it was up 11% in 2019, which is really big. We see tremendous growth in the A2 milk category. And then on the right here, this is just an example of what we're calling premium milks, right? So this is a milk, it's made from Jersey cows. It's whole milk, ultra pasteurized. It's not just chocolate milk, it's midnight chocolate milk. And it has a premium price tag too. So their premium milks are also seeing a lot of growth. So there are some bright spots in fluid milk, but of course these products are small and pale in comparison to the volume of just the regular white milk. So they're not enough to lift the whole category, but there are some bright spots in the category too. But I mentioned that retail sales are down for fluid milk, and I'm just talking about white milk here. And what it means is that we lost nearly 75 million gallons of white milk from 2017 versus the year before. 75 million fewer gallons of milk were sold. And let me just clarify one thing. When I talk about gallons, I'm not talking about literal gallon jugs of milk. It's just the term we use to measure volume. So if you bought 8 pints of milk, you bought a gallon of milk. So you'll hear me say gallons. I don't literally mean a jug. but 75 million fewer gallons were sold. So when I hear that, I think, interesting, but where did it go? What happened to that 75 million gallons? What did consumers do instead? Did they buy a replacement? Did they do a substitution? What happened? So we worked with our partners at DMI and our retail vendor at IRI to do what we call a source of volume analysis. The source of volume analysis, I will not bore you with all of the details. If anybody wants to talk about research methodology, please come see me afterward. It's the second favorite topic for me after cheese. So I'm happy to explain all the ins and outs to you, but suffice it to say the source of volume analysis looks at what consumers bought this year versus what they bought last year and measures how they change. So we can measure everything that you buy at grocery because it gets scanned in the grocery store. We can also track certain consumers over time to see how they're changing, what replacements they're making. So when we do the source of volume analysis, we see that we lost nearly 5 million households. So 4.7 million households stopped buying milk altogether in 2017. They bought it in 2016. They abandoned the category in 2017. And that represents 19.6 million gallons of that milk. But at the same time, we found new buyers. So 4.1 million households who had not purchased milk the year before came to the category and bought 12 million gallons. So they offset some of the lost buyers, but clearly not enough, so that we were still down 7.6 million gallons of milk. But of course, I told you we lost 74.6 million gallons. What happened to the rest of it? Of course, a lot of households stayed in the category. They didn't abandon milk altogether. They just changed how much milk they bought. So we do a buyer migration analysis, and in 2016, we see that 44% of households were classified as light milk buyers. This means they bought fewer than 12.5 gallons of milk a year. We see 31% are medium, meaning they bought between 12.5 and 31 gallons a year. And then a quarter of households were heavy milk buying households, buying more than 31 gallons of milk in a year. 2016, this is. So we look at what happened in 2017. How did they change what they buy? And we see a lot of migration up and down the chain here. So of our light buyers, most of them stayed light buyers. They continued to buy fewer than 12.5 gallons. Some of them bought a little more. Our medium buyers, we see a quarter of them bought less milk in 2017 than they did the year before. And our heavy buyers, again, a quarter of them started to buy less milk than they did the year before. So they're not abandoning the milk category. They're still buying dairy milk. They're just buying less of it. So what did they do? Oh, sorry. So then in a nutshell, this is how they net out. So it used to be 25% were heavy. Now we're down to 22% are heavy buyers. And when we're talking 120 million households buying milk, this really adds up. So this accounts for that 74.6 million gallons of lost milk in 2017 versus the year before. Okay, so they bought less milk, but what did they do instead, right? We know that 85% of them bought something else. So they made a replacement, they made a substitution. The remaining 15% here likely didn't decide that they just weren't that thirsty or that hydration was overhyped. They probably moved to something that we can't track through our grocery outlets. So this is probably tap water. It might be whiskey, I don't know. I am not here to judge, but it's something that we don't track. But we do know that 85%, almost everybody substituted that dairy milk for something else. So what did they buy instead? 53% of the volume that we lost year over year went to, it wasn't almond milk, it wasn't soy milk, it was bottled water. Bottled water has just really been on a tear since it was brought to the market. I think Dasani came to market in 1990, early 90s, and then Aquafina, and then go into a grocery store now, there's a gazillion brands of bottled water. This is all despite a lot of concerns about bottled water, right? We've heard it's just tap water. There's a lot of concerns about the environmental issues with all of those plastic bottles. Now there's water rights issues coming to the forefront. But despite all of that, bottled water has really been responsible for half of our lost milk volume year over year. Following water, it's coffee. So 11% of the volume we lost was substituted for coffee. And this could be things like the coffee that we're drinking here today, ground coffee, whole bean coffee. There's been a lot of innovation in coffee too, right? This example here, the Starbucks ready to drink. This is a double shot espresso, but of course you can get a Frappuccino or a cappuccino or a latte, whatever. Cold brew coffees, a lot of innovation in coffee, the Keurig pods. So coffee has taken 11% of the volume too, which kind of makes sense because milk is often consumed at breakfast, so is coffee. So there's an easy substitution there for consumers. Then it's tea. 8% of the volume we lost was substituted for tea. Might be hot tea, might be the ready-to-drink teas that we see here. Now, of course, our sparkling teas, enhanced teas. Then it's juices. It's still not almond milk. Now, the juice category has struggled in recent years. Sales have been down, primarily due to concerns about sugar content. This especially hit the orange juice category hard, but there are some growth pockets in juice. Primarily what we're seeing here is this cold pressed juice, which is fairly new to the market, stealing some share from milk as well. And then finally, after bottled water, after coffee, after tea, after juice, then finally here is where we see the kind of plant-based or the vegan milks show up, taking 6.6% of the volume that we lost, just rounded up to 7 here for the sake of a chart. So it's not really the primary competitor that we think it is, right? It's after all of these other products. Then rounding out the chart here, we have the sports drinks, right? The Gatorades and all of the Powerades. Then the energy drinks, your Red Bulls, your Monster Energies, lots of growth in that category too. And then finally, just the other, any beverage that doesn't fit one of those categories, we lump into other. But I think this is really interesting because when we as an industry think about our competitors, when we think about milk alternatives, this is what we think about, right? We think about almond milk, soy milk, cashew milk. One thing I'll point out here, you'll notice that soy milk already says soy beverage. The almond milk says Almond Breeze almond milk as one word. But regardless, if this is called soy beverage, the consumer is calling it soy milk. So we can call it whatever we want to. It's sold in the milk aisle. They're pouring it on their cereal. They're putting it in their coffee. So consumers are going to call it soy milk. But I digress. My point is, this is what we think of when we think of milk alternatives, right? We think of these types of products. But as we just saw, the products that are stealing our share, this is what consumers think of when they think of alternatives. They don't limit themselves the way that we do. They're not as narrowly focused, right? They have a whole world of options. And we spend a lot of time thinking about these vegan milks, right? An outsized amount of time. 6.6% of our volume went to them, 53% to water. But we think that they are the ones who are holding us back. If the entire plant-based milk category disappeared, never existed, instead of losing 74.6 million gallons of milk year over year, we would have lost 70 million gallons. So they are a competitor, absolutely. Are they our biggest competitor? No. Are they our only competitor? Absolutely not. So it's important to keep this in mind, because I think sometimes we can get a little lost because they're using our words, right? So it's easier to get mad at them. So I mentioned household penetration of dairy milk, 93%. For the non-dairy, less than half that, 45%. It's still not a small number. But to keep things in perspective, 93% of households have dairy milk, 45% have non-dairy. But despite that, we do know that sales of these non-dairy beverages are growing. We saw that fluid milk is down. At the same time, the non-dairy is up. There's no denying that. But when I put those two bar charts on the same axes, when I showed you the milk before it was on billions of gallons, I have to put the non-dairy on millions of gallons, or you can't see the numbers. So this helps put it in perspective. Yes, fluid milk is declining, non-dairy is increasing, but look at the size of the difference here, right? When we look at category share, dairy milk comprises 92% of the milk category, non-dairy only 8%. And I'm not saying that to dismiss non-dairy milk. I don't think we should take our eyes off of them, because though they are only 8% market share, it's been growing over time. As fluid milk's share has declined, non-dairy's has inclined, such that dairy is down 18% over 5 years, and non-dairy's up 47%. So I'm not dismissing them. I mean, those are numbers to be thinking about. But I just want to put it all in perspective so that we're all starting with the same foundation here. And I just want to quickly mention non-dairy cheese. This isn't a new category, but there's been a lot of growth in it lately. These are just some examples of cheeses, quote unquote cheeses, don't throw any shoes at me. Some examples of products you can find just at any old grocery store. It used to be if you wanted a non-dairy cheese alternative, you probably had to go to a co-op, to a natural food store, maybe to Whole Foods. You can get these at the Pick and Save right down the street from my house. So there is a lot of growth in this category, and I just mentioned it because I want us to be aware of what's out there. It is a very small category, and yet the growth has been really quite incredible, where sales of these non-dairy cheeses are up 400% in the past 5 years. That sounds really tremendous, 400%, and yet the non-dairy cheeses are only about 0.2% of the cheese category overall. Again, I'm not saying dismiss it, be aware of it. This might become a bigger issue in the future, but put it all in perspective, it's a very tiny piece of the puzzle right now. Okay, so that is just setting the stage that we all have the same foundation of what we're talking about when we talk about what's happening in the world of retail in terms of dairy and non-dairy milk. But we wanted to understand how consumers view these two products in terms of their nutrition and sustainability profiles. We know that nutrition and sustainability are becoming more and more important to consumers in their purchase decisions. Nutrition has always been important, but it's getting more important. Sustainability is really a hot topic now. So how do consumers view these products? Right, again, it's my job to bring the voice of the consumer into the organization, into the industry. So we did research to do exactly this so that I can tell you what the consumers are thinking. So we talked to 800 consumers across all the generations. We talked to Gen Zers, we talked to the millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers in proportions that are representative of how they look in the population at large. We screened out people who are lactose intolerant. You couldn't participate if you have a nut allergy or if you identified as vegan. And we didn't want to interview those people because we thought that those things might influence how they responded to the rest of our survey. So we started by showing consumers just 2 nutrition labels. We didn't tell them what they were looking at, what products these were for. Here are 2 labels, just look at them. I will tell you, the one on the left is almond milk, the one on the right is 1% dairy milk, but we didn't tell the consumers that. And we had to choose specific products because, of course, almond milk has a different nutritional profile than soy milk does, than rice milk does. And 1% has a different nutritional profile than whole milk, for example. But we chose these products because almond milk is about 75% of the non-dairy milk category. And though it is true that whole milk is seeing increases at retail, still reduced fat milk is the bulk of the fluid milk category. So we chose those 2 products, showed them these labels, again, didn't tell them what was what. They had no idea what they were looking at, and we just asked them, based only on this, if this is all the information you had, do you think that how strongly do you agree or disagree that the product is nutritious? So 68%, 2/3, said the almond milk label is from a product that's nutritious. 53% said the dairy milk is nutritious based on its label. And then we asked them, okay, if you could only pick one of these, which one is more nutritious? And what we saw here was 72%, nearly 3/4 of the consumers picked the almond milk label as the more nutritious label. Of course, 28% chose the dairy milk. And 2 factors really drive this perception of being more nutritious, and that's the calorie content. Right, the almond milk has far fewer calories than dairy, 30 calories per serving for almond milk, 110 for dairy. And then the sugar content. 0 grams of sugar in the almond, 12 grams in the dairy. You and I all know that sugar content in the dairy milk is lactose. But consumers, first of all, consumers don't know what product they're looking at, so they wouldn't know it was lactose. And even if they did know it was milk, I suspect very few of them would understand what lactose is. So this is very interesting to me because we know that sugar is having a really hard time right now. And consumers are, of course, concerned about calories. We hear all the time that consumers are kind of changing how they view health and wellness. And it's less about avoiding these bad factors, like remember the low-fat craze of the 90s and the early 2000s. It's less about that now, and it's more about functional benefits. What can a product give to me? And that is certainly true, but there is still some truth to the fact that consumers are avoiding what they see as bad things as well. Now, those who chose the dairy milk zoned in on the protein content. Right, dairy milk, 8 grams of protein, 1 gram in the almond milk, and we know that the protein trend has been booming for years. That is not changing, but it's not enough to offset calories and sugar. We do see some generational differences here. Our younger consumers, so our Gen Zers and our millennials, are more likely to consider vitamins and minerals as an indicator of a nutritious product than others are. The millennials also look at calories and sodium more than the Gen Zers do. And then our Gen Xers primarily zone in on calorie content when they're considering nutrition, to some degree sugar and sodium. And then our boomers, their number one indicator of nutrition is sodium content, followed by sugar and calories. So some generational differences that are interesting as we see how the generations will shift and change our consumer base moving forward. Okay, so at this point in the research, up until now, we haven't told them what we're talking about. We've just been looking at these two labels blindly in a vacuum. Now we introduce the category, tell them what we're talking about. We give them some examples just to make sure we all know what we're talking about. And now we ask them to rate dairy milk versus almond milk on some nutrition components. Whereas before, you'll remember when they were just looking at the nutrition label, they said that almond milk was healthier. 72% said almond milk was healthier. But when we actually talk to them about dairy milk versus almond milk, dairy milk wins, right? Dairy rates higher than almond milk on is nutritious, on good for me, source of protein, calcium, similar in sugar, wide variety of nutrients, and lower on artificial ingredients. So clearly, dairy's reputation for being nutritious is well understood among consumers. Once they start thinking not about nutrition labels, but about dairy, they recognize that it is nutritious and it is healthy. We also see some interesting differences among the generations here. So I'm just pulling out the two big kind of overarching nutrition attributes: is nutritious and is good for me. Looking at total population, so we see that there's a gap, right? Dairy milk rates higher than almond milk, so it's seen as more nutritious, more likely to be good for me. But when we look at millennials, millennials are as likely as the total population to see dairy as healthy, which I think sometimes gets lost on it, right? We think that millennials are anti-dairy. They're not. They rate dairy milk just as highly as the total population does. But they differ in that they also rate almond milk as healthy as dairy, so that gap between dairy and almond really closes, right? It was a 16, 14 point gap among the total population, 3 and 0. So it's not that they don't think dairy is healthy, they do. They just think almond milk is as healthy. Totally different story with our baby boomers, right? They rate dairy milk higher than the total population, more nutritious, more likely to be good for me, and then they rate almond milk lower, so that gap is much bigger. So just some interesting generational differences there too. So then we ask consumers, okay, if you had to guess, and we're not showing them the labels at this point, just talking to them and just about the products, if you had to guess, which do you think has more protein, dairy milk or almond milk? Only 63% say dairy milk has more protein. If you'll recall, it was 8 grams of protein in the dairy milk, 1 gram in the almond milk. But consumers do think that almond milk has protein in it. It comes from almonds, in their minds anyway. Almonds have protein. Of course, almond milk would have protein. They're wrong. Almond milk does not have more protein than dairy. And interestingly, consumers who buy almond milk are more likely to get this wrong, which on the one hand confuses me a little bit because they have it in their fridge. They have plenty of opportunity to look at that nutrition label and see that there's no protein in it. But it's more likely that they're buying it because they think there's protein in it. So we asked the same question about calcium. If you had to guess, which do you think contains more calcium? And here, 82% say dairy milk, right? Calcium has long been dairy's claim to fame. Calcium and dairy are just intertwined in consumers' minds. So 82% say dairy milk has more calcium. They're also wrong. Because of course, the almond milk and these other vegan milks are so heavily fortified that they actually do contain more calcium than dairy. But it doesn't matter. They can put as much calcium as they want in those products. Dairy and calcium are just joined at the hip. See some other generational differences here. The millennials are surprisingly more likely to know that dairy milk has more protein, whereas Gen Xers are more likely to get it wrong and say almond milk. I'm so ashamed of my generation here, but Xer is more likely to get that one wrong. So then we finally showed them the labels again and say, all right, we showed you the labels, we're talking about dairy milk, we're talking about almond milk, tell us which goes for which. Which one is the almond milk label, which one's the dairy milk label? And 2/3 get it right, but 1/3 of them get it wrong. 1/3 of them say that the product on the left is dairy milk, but it isn't. And I don't know for certain because we did not ask a follow-up question here, but I'm guessing that those who didn't know, who didn't have really a firm grasp of what the label looked like, probably zoned in on the calcium content here and said, all right, I don't really know. So I'm gonna guess that that one with more calcium is the dairy milk. Because again, dairy and calcium just are linked in consumers' minds. So then we asked some other questions. In general, which product do you think is more nutritious? We didn't tell them which label went with which product yet, just asked them which is more nutritious. 40% say dairy milk is more nutritious. Okay, that's great. That's more than the 25% who said almond milk was nutritious, but we have about 1/3 that say, yeah, they're about the same, equally nutritious. Then we tell them which label goes with which product. And here we see dairy drop. Again, it's that sugar content that consumers don't understand as lactose. They don't know that it's not an added sugar, and it's the calorie content. So here, when they're looking at the label side by side with almond milk, dairy drops, almond gains, and even that part in the middle kind of shrinks a little bit. But then we show them the ingredient list. And when we show them the ingredient list, things change, right? Here, dairy really wins. 62% say dairy is more nutritious when you look at the ingredients. And almond milk falls to 20%. And when we look at the ingredient list, it's no wonder why they say that. These are the ingredients on almond milk on the left and dairy on the right. So we know that in consumers' minds, nutrition goes far beyond just that nutrition facts label. It includes things like the ingredient list. It includes sustainability, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But before we talk about sustainability, I just wanted to pull out some numbers from some research we did on non-dairy versus dairy cheese. This is a different study, so it's a different group of consumers. We talked to 600 consumers, 18 plus, who'd purchased cheese or non-dairy cheese within the past month. Ask them to rate the two products. Similarly to what we saw with the milk category, we do see that when we talk about overall nutrition, consumers are more likely to say that dairy is nutritious than the non-dairy. But again, we've got a big chunk in the middle, 37% saying that non-dairy cheese is as nutritious as dairy cheese. We asked about protein, quality protein content. We see more consumers saying that dairy has high quality protein than the non-dairy cheeses. And one thing I want to point out here is you'll notice this bar does not add up to 100%. And this, I think, is because of how we worded the question. We didn't ask about protein content. We asked about quality protein. And this is an important lesson for me as someone who just said I try to bring the voice of the consumer into the organization. It's really interesting to learn that when we talk about protein quality, consumers have no idea what that means. So the rest of these consumers said, I don't know. They don't understand things like bioavailability and digestibility, right? That's not a consumer term, so they don't know how to answer this one. So it's, again, just an important lesson to think about using the consumer's language as we talk to them. And then we talked about natural, whatever that means. Again, we see the same thing. Dairy rates higher than non-dairy, but a big chunk in the middle. And when we look at the purchase drivers of dairy cheese versus non-dairy cheese, the dairy cheese drivers, this makes sense to me, right? You buy dairy cheese because it tastes great. It's a great flavor profile, habit, you've been buying it all your life. People who buy these non-dairy cheeses cite some curious reasons for their purchase, right? Health, it's natural, no additives, low fat, lactose free, low in calories. It's a curious list because with the exception of 2 of these, I don't think they're true. Sure, non-dairy cheese is lactose free and low in cholesterol, but to claim that it's healthier than dairy cheese, I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of health and natural. No additives is a real stretch. But it doesn't matter if it's true, it's what consumers perceive to be true. And this is what they're thinking about when they're making these non-dairy cheese purchases. Okay, so I mentioned I also want to talk about sustainability. Nutrition and sustainability are both becoming more and more important to consumers, and they're linked. And sustainability in particular is becoming more important in the purchase decision for consumers. And it will no longer be, companies will no longer be able to not address the sustainability issue, right? We see in this quote, like nutrition, sustainability will become an expectation for companies to offer. Taste is always going to be important. We'll always have to deliver products that taste good. Price is always going to be important to consumers. Convenience will always be important. But those things will no longer be enough. We're going to have to address sustainability because it's becoming more and more important to consumers. So how do consumers view sustainability as it comes to food? 59% say it's very important to them that the foods that they consume are produced in an environmentally sustainable way. I suspect this number will not decline anytime soon. And it's becoming a very big issue in the dairy industry, in every industry really, but in dairy too, right? This is an ad from Oatly. Oatly is a very hot new non-dairy alternative product made from oats. Their sales were up 140% year over year. And their claim is that they use 60% less energy in production than dairy and produce 80% less greenhouse gas emissions. So their ad here is really touting that. Show us your numbers, we'll show you ours. So if it wasn't already an issue, and it is, Oatly's bringing it to the forefront here. So when we look at dairy, how consumers perceive sustainability in the world of dairy, we know from a consumer confidence tracker that we do that consumers are generally fairly positive about how dairy performs in terms of sustainability, right? 2/3 say dairy is a sustainable practice, and more than half agree that dairy farmers are actively improving their sustainability practices. When we drill down a little bit, try to get a little bit narrower from this vague sustainability, we see 35% say that dairy does not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And just under half agree that dairy farmers are actively reducing their environmental impact. So they do see positives in the world of dairy as it relates to sustainability. And when we looked at our previous study where I talked about the dairy versus almond research that we did, we also asked environmental sustainability questions. How would you rate dairy milk? How would you rate almond milk on these attributes? We see very similar scores as produced in an environmentally sustainable manner. These numbers are not statistically significantly different from one another, so consumers see almond milk and dairy milk as the same in terms of environmentally sustainable production. Slightly higher numbers for dairy in terms of contributing to climate change, about the same in threat to clean water. But what I find most interesting about this research is not this slide, which shows you what % of consumers agree with these statements, but it's when we look at the percentage of consumers who say they don't know. We have more consumers saying they don't know if dairy is environmentally sustainable. I don't know if it contributes to climate change. I don't know if it's a threat to clean water. For both dairy and almond milk, they just don't know. And I think this is a great opportunity for us as an industry to really engage with consumers. They don't know what sustainability means to them, so we can lean in and help educate them and have this conversation with them and start defining sustainability before somebody else like Oatly does. Because we have a really great story to tell. And when I look at these numbers of don't knows, I think that's a huge opportunity for us. We also asked in general, which do you think is better for the environment? Instead of just rating them, now you have to pick one which is better. Almond milk does rate higher on being environmentally sustainable in terms of production than dairy, twice as high. And yet we still see 50% here saying they're about the same. And I'm guessing that's that ambivalence about I just don't know. So we'll say they're about the same. We do see some differences here. Gen Xers are less likely to say that dairy is better than almond milk. We know that those who claim to be environmentalists say that almond milk is better for the environment. And interestingly, dairy consumers are not more apt to say that dairy is better, But almond milk consumers are more likely to say that almond milk is better for the environment, which just suggests that there probably is some environmental reason for their purchase. And we know that sustainability influences how consumers view the nutrition of a product. This research is from IFIC. They showed consumers the same nutrition label for two products. The nutrition facts are the same for both products, and yet they're produced in slightly different ways. The one here, the fourth down, the product that has the same nutrition but is produced in a more environmentally sustainable way is far more likely to be seen as healthier than the other product. So sustainability and nutrition are intertwined in consumers' minds. And we know from our research that 44% of consumers say that products that are produced in a sustainable manner are more nutritious. If it's better for the planet, it's better for me. So sustainable nutrition, those things go hand in hand. Again, some generational differences. This is far more likely to be seen in the younger generations, right? The Gen Zers and the millennials, more than half of them say sustainability equals nutrition. Only 28% of baby boomers. And then we see that those who call themselves foodies, those who call themselves health nuts, and who call themselves environmentalists are all more likely to say sustainability equals nutritious. So too our parents. Those who have kids see these things far more intertwined than those who don't have kids. Okay, so we know that sustainability is important. We know that consumers really want sustainable products. We know that they see sustainable as nutritious, but what does it mean? We do have some research. This is research from the Hartman Group that they worked with DMI to do research, and they asked consumers exactly that. All right, what does sustainability mean to you? We got a bunch of different responses. Most popular here, ability to last over time. Then we see conserving natural resources, reduce, reuse, recycle, environmentally friendly, which is great. It's a great list. There's still a lot of ambiguity here, though, isn't there? If I were to tell you that sustainability is defined as environmentally friendly, well, what does that mean? So consumers really are struggling with their own definition here, which again, I think is a great opportunity for us. So here consumers could say whatever they wanted. There's other research done by IFIC where they gave them a list and said, of these, which of these definitions do you think defines sustainability? We hear limiting amount of pesticides as the most popular way to define sustainability. But then we see some other options too, ensuring affordable food supply, conserving the natural habitat, less waste. This is for food production in general. Of course, in this room, we care not about food production in general. Well, we do. But we also care about dairy specifically. So in our research, we asked just that. So thinking just about the dairy industry, just about dairy, how would you define sustainability just when you think about dairy? We see some interesting things pop up here. Most popular, spreading manure, no chemical fertilizers. In fact, we see manure show up a lot here on this chart, which I think makes sense because consumers get that. They know what that is. If you're going to talk to a consumer about an anaerobic digester, that's a little bit harder for them to understand, but they get what manure is, so it pops up here. We see a lot of that here and how they define it. We also see the second one, farmers keep their cows happy and healthy. So that's an animal welfare issue showing up in our definition of sustainability. So just like if it's better for me, it's better for the planet, so too if it's better for the animals, it's better for the planet. So a lot of these issues are intertwined in consumers' minds, and you really can't parse them out. We have to talk about these things as consumers see them. And then interestingly here at the bottom, the economic impact of dairy is far less a part of the definition of sustainability for dairy, even though we saw ability to last over time, which certainly has economic implications. The economic impact here is far less so for dairy. So when I look at this research, I just see that it indicates huge opportunities for us as an industry, right? When we think about nutrition, we saw that consumers are looking at that sugar content as an indicator of how healthy a product is. So it's January 2020, so this is the deadline for food manufacturers to update their nutrition labels. They'll have to call out added sugars. I think that is a great thing for dairy. When a consumer looks at the nutrition facts panel now and it says 11 grams of sugar, it'll say 0 grams of added sugar. But I don't think we have to necessarily hide that on the back of the package, right? We could call out no added sugars because that matters to consumers. Avoiding sugar is a very hot topic for consumers now. Same thing with the ingredient list, right? We saw how having a cleaner label, a limited number of ingredients, makes consumers understand or think that the product is healthier. So we can highlight that. We can highlight our limited number of ingredients, not just in fluid milk, but even in cheese. Right? We don't have to hide that information away on the back of the panel. So there's certainly opportunities there. There's opportunities with sustainability, like I just talked about, great opportunities to lean into the consumer conversation and help them define sustainability while we still can. You'll notice that on the charts that I showed you, greenhouse gas emissions never showed up, and yet that's what Oatly is touting, because they're leaning in and saying, you know what, we can win on this, so let's define sustainability for consumers. Let's not let them do that. We can be part of this conversation. So I think there is great opportunity. Yes, things are declining for fluid milk, but overall dairy consumption is up, and we really do have a great opportunity with consumers as long as we're really understanding what it is that they're thinking and how they're feeling about the category. So that is what I have to share with you today. I'm happy to take any questions. I saw a number of people taking pictures. I'm happy to make the slides available to anybody who wants a copy.
On. So in the definition of sustainability and in your definition, Oatly's definition, is that measurement per ounce of milk? Is it per calorie? Is
Yeah.
it per, what did they define the definition into?
So for greenhouse gas emissions, like it's X number per, it's a great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head how Oatly is defining it. I know there is an industry definition, and I'm guessing it's based on volume produced and not based on calorie. It must be based on volume, but I can look into that for you. What else? Any other questions?
Maybe not so much a question as an observation, but most people understand certain fruits have natural sugar, bananas, grapes. Can't we somehow explain to them this is natural sugar or label it natural sugar on the label?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really will help when they start to see no added sugars. Because you're right, I mean, although there are some people who avoid fruits because of the sugars too. So there is an educational curve regardless of the category. But I really do think that calling out no added sugars will be a huge help.
So you've identified several limitations and things. So do you have recommendations for what's the path forward? How do we, what should be our game plan? What's our goal? What's our path forward here to combat this?
Yeah, first I think we really do need to focus on sustainable nutrition as a single thing. It's very tempting to want to pull out sustainability, and it's tempting to pull out nutrition as two separate entities, but now that we see that consumers view these as the same, one and the same, we need to talk about sustainable nutrition as a single attribute. And I know that DMI is focused on sustainable nutrition because of that. Like I said, I think it's really important to just understand what the consumers are thinking. So it is understanding that they are still avoiding calories. It's understanding that they are looking at sugar content and calling it out and helping them understand that the sugar in milk is not added sugar. From the sustainability perspective, I think there's a lot more work to do in sustainability because the consumers don't really know what it means. And frankly, I'm not sure that all of industry really knows what it means either. So I think there's a lot more research to be done there. But at the end of the day, I think the number one thing that we can do is really engage with consumers and try to understand them because we need them. I think sometimes we can be really, we can kind of, we pit ourselves against consumers because they're not doing what we want them to do. We want to force them to buy our products. But if we can really kind of change that mentality and listen to them and understand them, I think that will be a far bigger help to us. Well, if there are no other questions, I thank you all for your time this morning. I understand. Oh, we have one more question? I won't cut you off.
My question is simple, so our gallon of milk is the same gallon of milk that my parents bought and their parents bought.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to convince them, If I go to the store now, I can tell you my kids are drawn more to the almond beverage, the oat. It's a cool container. Why don't we address changing the container and putting more information on the container that actually relates to what consumers want?
Yeah.
That's the easiest way to change.
And I think that's a really great point. And I know there are products out there that are doing that. For fluid milk, having national distribution for a single product is a challenge. So like I showed you, one of those areas that are seeing growth, that the premium milks are doing exactly that. Understanding that labeling matters in sales, so does the packaging. All of that stuff really matters. So there are brands that are getting it and doing that. But as the industry overall is enormous, right? There's a lot of challenges there. But I think people are paying attention to that, and it is happening, just not as quickly and not on the scale that we're looking for. Any last questions? All right. I thank you very much for your time. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you this morning, and I'll stick around if there are any last-minute questions after the fact. Thank you.